All right, I think we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm Tori Weber, Associate Director of Programs and Fellowships at the Kenyon Review, and I am very excited to welcome you all to our first event of this year's Kenyon Review Literary Festival featuring Rita Dove. Rita Dove will be here at the end of the week. Please come to her keynote lecture, which will happen Friday, November 9th at 8 p.m. in Ross Hall. That's free and open to the public, no tickets necessary. Doors will open 7:30, so get there early for a good seat. We will be selling books before and after her talk, and she will be signing books after her talk. So we hope to see you there. We also have events going on all week long. Today we are about to have this wonderful conversation about her poetry. Tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. in Brandy Recital Hall, we will have the music and poetry of Sonata Mulatika. We will have some readings from her book, Sonata Mulatika, and a music performance of a Beethoven sonata and a Viotti concerto. So that should be really fun. Wednesday and Thursday, we are welcoming the GLCA New Writers Award winners. Hillary Plum will be here Wednesday, 410 in Cheever. She won the Nonfiction Award. And Emily Fridland will be here Thursday, 410 in Cheever. She won the Fiction Award. And then Friday is our main event. So I hope to see you at a lot of these events. We're really excited about them. Before I turn it over to Jené Schoenfeld, join me in turning your phones to a quieter mode. And I will hand it over to you, Jené. Thank you.
Okay, so it occurred to me that I should add to introduce panelists, maybe introduce myself. So if you don't know me, I'm Professor Schoenfeld. I teach in the English department. I teach African American literature, mostly narrative though, and I'm currently the chair in the department. And I had everybody alphabetical, but I guess I'll go this way. So, no, there's no assigned seating, it's all right. So Andy Grace teaches also in the English department at Kenyon and is the acting poetry editor for the Kenyon Review. He is the author of 3 books of poems. And Keith S. Wilson is an Appalachian poet, Kenyon Fellow, graduate of the Caloo Creative Writing Workshop. Keith serves as assistant poetry editor at 4-Way Review, digital media editor at Obsidian Journal, and Keith's first book, Field Notes on Ordinary Love, will be published by Copper Canyon in 2019. Eloisa Amezcua, okay, is from Arizona. Her debut collection, From the Inside Quietly, is the inaugural winner of the Shelter Belt Poetry Prize, selected by Ada Limon. MacDowell Fellow, her poems and translations are published in New York Times Magazine, Poetry Magazine, Kenyon Review, Gulf Coast, and others. Eloisa lives in Columbus, Ohio, and is the founder of Costura Creative. Okay. And Hanif Abdurraqib, all right, is a poet, essayist, and cultural critic from Columbus, Ohio. His first full-length poetry collection, The Crown Ain't Worth Much, was released in June 2016 from Button Poetry. Was named a finalist for the Eric Hoffer Book Prize and was nominated for a Hurston Wright Legacy Award. He's done lots of other interesting stuff about which you should find him at the end. So these are our panelists. I'm sure that on Friday there will be a much more eloquent introduction of Rita Dove. But I want to give you just a little bit about her in case you're not familiar with the poet we're honoring. She was born in Akron, Ohio. She graduated summa cum laude from Miami University. So she's an Ohio poet, but obviously an Ohio poet of national renown. And again, so as not to take up all of our time, I'm going to give you a brief highlights of her honors drawn from her University of Virginia faculty bio page. I have to give you my source because I'm an English professor. I want you to have your sources, right? So Ms. Dove was the U.S. Poet Laureate from 1993 to 95 and Special Consultant in Poetry for the Library of Congress Bicentennial in 1999-2000. She served as the Poet Laureate of Virginia from 2004 to 2006. She received the 1987 Pulitzer Prize in Poetry for her book Thomas and Beulah. Her other books of poetry include Collective Poems, 1974 to 2004, Sonata Mulatika, American Smooth, Omnibus with Rosa Parks, Mother Love, Grace Notes Museum, The Yellow House on the Corner, and Selected Poems. She has also published a collection of stories, Fifth Sunday, a novel, Through the Ivory Gate, a collection of her Poet Laureate lectures, The Poet's World, and a verse drama, The Darker Face of the Earth, which had its premiere at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival in 1996 and was produced by the Kennedy Center and Royal National Theatre, among others. Her song cycle, 7 for Luck, was set to music by John Williams and premiered at Tanglewood in 1998. In the following year, she collaborated with John Williams and Steven Spielberg on America's Millennium. She also edited the seminal anthologies of Best American Poetry 2000 and the Penguin Anthology of 20th Century American Poetry. Ms. Dove has received, in addition, 27 honorary doctorates and a number of other honors and awards. So we're very excited that she's coming. And I want to start by inviting each of our panelists to speak for a few minutes about Rita Dove's work, and I encourage them to maybe consider sharing with us in what context they first encountered her work and how her work maybe has influenced their own as poets. So, should we go that way?
Sure.
All right.
I first read Rita Dove here when I was an undergraduate at Kenyon. In my intro to poetry workshop, we had an anthology as a textbook that was like mid-20th century poets. Everybody got their 5 pages, and our assignment every week was to do a write-up of one of the poets that we chose, just leafing through the collection. And so I went to the Dove section, and the first poem that really struck me was this poem called Parsley, which is probably her most famous poem. Most anthologized, most invisible. And I did not understand it. Not because the language was that difficult, but it was about a historical event that I knew nothing about. So it was one of those poems that sent me to the computer to do research, which is an experience I hadn't had much before. So the poem is about 1930s Dominican Republic, Haiti. There was a sort of an unspecified border between those two countries for a century, and the dictator Rafael Trujillo decided that it was time to have a firm border, and that he's a Dominican dictator, if any Haitians were found across that border, the penalty was death. And because it was sort of like a loose border at that time, there were Haitians living all across that borderline because they didn't know that was the border, and they didn't know that they would be killed for living over there. So his next logistical problem was, well, how do you tell Haitians from Dominicans? What if the Haitians try to pass as Dominicans and then we're about to kill them? And the test, this is where the poem's title comes from, was whether you could pronounce the Spanish word for parsley. Because the Spanish word for parsley requires you to roll an R. And the Dominicans, who were Spanish speaking, would be able to do it. And if you were Haitian, you were coming from a more French Creole language situation in which you probably wouldn't be able to fake rolling your R's. And so that was the test. Say the word parsley, the Spanish word for parsley out loud. If you rolled the R, you lived. If you didn't, you died. And this is tens of thousands of people. So that struck me that I would have to do research to understand a poem. And eventually it dawned on me that you could probably do a pretty good DIY liberal arts education by just reading poems and looking up what they're about. I can learn history from Dove, I can learn geology from Brenda Hillman, I can learn about dance from Michael Palmer, I can learn Robert Hass has the good recipes in the poems, so I can cook dinner also. Maybe somebody out there. So that struck me, but also it's a poem in 2 parts. The second part isn't in the voice of Trujillo, but it's third person, but it's basically his interior state, grieving over his mother. And that also, a lot of times, a lot of my students, you'll roll your eyes because I've said this a lot, but a lot of my introduction into poetry was just finding permission to do things I didn't think I was allowed to do. And so a poet inhabiting the voice of this terrible man, not that she humanizes him or rationalizes what he did or anything, but just the audacity of saying, I'm going to write a poem sort of from the perspective of this person. I can write in personas that are unlikable or dangerous. That was one of the early things that struck me about her work.
So for me, I didn't know, I had never read, as far as I knew, a living poet until I was in late college, essentially. And my college had one creative writing professor who was who taught poetry, and I took him my 5th year of college because it took me 6 years to finish. And so that was like me essentially beginning to learn that people were like still writing poetry. And it, actually, I don't think it was even in that class that I learned about Rita Dove, but it was like immediately following that course, I began to read just like everything that I could find. And so I think it's probably like in like early grad school or in between my undergrad and graduate experience that I read Thomas and Beulah. Because actually, I think, because it had won the Pulitzer Prize. So there's like a side conversation thing that I'm going to go into right now, is that there's often like this really big conversation about whether people who are often not recognized with awards ought to even care about those awards because they don't represent whoever, black folks, they don't represent women, they don't represent whatever. And I both get that conversation and like to a certain degree agree with it, but the like flip side of that is that awards like introduce work to people who would otherwise never see it. So like I was just like going down the list of prizes and found her work that way. And for me it was really influential in part because in a lot of ways my experience is nothing like Rita Dove's. And in another sense, so my mom is white, but my dad is black, and his ancestry is essentially exactly the same as hers. So her grandmother came from Georgia to Ohio, and that's like my dad's grandmother. As far as I know, history is really difficult for a lot of black people. It's not always kept well. It's not always like loved. Yeah, exactly. Not well documented, right? Yeah. And the parts of it that are well documented are like not the things that you keep a lot of times in like a scrapbook or anything. And so it was like a really important book for me because in a way like it was my history even though it couldn't be my history. It was like a mythology in a sense. It was like one of a number of books that like reflected me. When you go from like not even really knowing that people are still writing poetry to suddenly finding that out, and then everything that you read is still like not very close to your experience, it's that's rough. But that was a book that kind of like got me into realizing that people were writing work that I appreciated and saw myself in.
I came to Rita, and this is like maybe a disservice to her and to like the actual poems, but I was introduced to her kind of like as a figure and as a pillar by my first poetry teacher in college as well. And he revered her as a figure. And she is like, probably in his trinity of poets. And so I always like approached her work with a sort of reverence, like the person who is teaching me learned how to write from this person, and that's really crazy. But so I often think of Rita Dove as like this pillar. Like you said, she won the Pulitzer Prize. She's the second black person to win the Pulitzer Prize, and the first two, the first before that was Gwendolyn Brooks in 1950. So, and in the 37 years between Gwendolyn Brooks and Rita Dove, only white people won the Pulitzer Prize. And she's the first black poet laureate. And so I often think about how Rita Dove has like had to carry that throughout her career. Thomas and Beulah was the first book that I read too of hers. And if we're talking about like favorite poems, I love there are like 4 or 5 variation poems on there, and like variation on guilt, variation on pain, and those are probably my favorites. But yeah, so I'm always thinking of her like as a figure, and the ways that both her like career, the poems themselves, and her as a figure have like
in a way made space for all four of the poets up here. You know, like she's writing about a place that most people might not find interesting, which like Andy's work, or what I know of like the current work is like place, you know, and it's also Ohio based, which is super, you know, she created a way for that. And, you know, as like 3 writers of color and 2 Black writers up here, like we possibly wouldn't, there wouldn't be space for us right now if it weren't for her making space for writers like us. So yeah, I think that's how I think of her. The poems are great.
One of my earliest poetry mentors is a poet, Will Evans, who is a Columbus poet who's originally from Youngstown in the northeastern corridor of Ohio, kind of Youngstown, Akron, Cleveland, is kind of known for just a really strong lineage of poets. You know, Rita Dove and Van Jordan went to the same high school, different years, but same high school. Ross Gay's from Youngstown. You know, there's just Barbara Fant's from Youngstown. You know, there's just something happening in that kind of, that specific corner. I think it has a lot to do with factory towns and what happens when the industry collapses, but I imagine that's a different thing. I came to poetry from, I was a music critic, and I had, you know, there's this trope that happens in lyrical music writing where God is used in song lyrics and still presented as grandiose. The way that songwriters build threads between God and the listener, or God themselves, it still creates a distance between a listener and whatever their divine power might be or might not be. And Will gave me this poem called "The Breathing, the Endless News." I think came out like the 80s, came out like 87 or 88. And the first line, is "Every God is lonely and exile composed in parts." And it was the first time I had really been able to relate to something that ascribed an emotion to God that felt like something that I felt. So the grounding of the divine was really important to me. And then the poem in general, it like ends with this image of children lining up. Does anyone read this poem? Does anyone know this poem? It ends with this image of children lining up toy dolls and shooting them. And I was thinking recently about, I was at visiting a friend's high school friend, not only mine, but a friend of Kenyon's. I was in our dear friend David Hall's classroom, high school classroom, and the students were like, oh, you know, like we got in trouble for like reading The Bluest Eye. So one kid was like, oh, like some shit popped off where like we were reading The Bluest Eye and like the school didn't fuck with it or whatever. And it was all, I know you're recording, sorry if I curse. And it was, we were talking about violence and we were talking about how, a thing I've been interested in and I've been dying to talk about more is about how the introduction of violence in writing is even that, like obviously is gendered, right? Where like, I think about Toni Morrison and Rita Dove and how the violence presents itself in their work as not matter of fact, like there's a weight to it, but it isn't gratuitous. You know, I really forgot what it was. There's like the Bluest Eye has like not Rita Dove, but the Bluest Eye has this like really gratuitous, like, not gratuitous, this really like in-depth violent scene, in the way that it's written is as distanced reportage, but there's an emotion to it. And I think about Rita Dove's poems, and I think about like American Smooth, which is the first book I got. I found like American Smooth in like a half-price books and got it in like 2011 or 12. And there's a lot of physicality in that book, and there's a lot of action in that book, but it's around like movement, the movement of bodies. And there's a weight to it that I think is really valuable. And all of this is to say that I've been thinking a lot about Rita because I've been thinking a lot about how violence presents itself in her poems and how writers can honor violence and give a weight to violence without seeming like they're squeezing every moment out of it for some pleasure beyond our understanding.
Eloisa mentioned a favorite poem or set of poems for her were the variation poems. Do others have favorite Dove poems you would share for those who might want to take notes about where to start? Anywhere you want.
Mine is that one. Mine is The Breathing, the Endless News, for sure. I think it's on the internet. It's in the poetry magazine.
Oh, good. Okay.
It's been mentioned a bunch, but all of Thomas and Beulah is pretty,
Yeah, I mean,
it's pretty divine.
That was like my favorite book, so I'm trying to see if I can find something outside of Thomas and Viola.
You could just tell them to read Thomas and Viola, that's
Yeah, I mean, that's, I would go with.
If you don't know the work, that's where to start, I think.
Yeah.
It's a version of her maternal grandparents. So half of the book is Thomas's story and half of the book is Beulah's story. And it's just fascinating. It's like, what I think about, I mean, we might get into like her and history. I think that the way that she uses history in that book is really fascinating because there's all sorts of big national events. There's like the Great Migration is in there, the Great Depression is in there, World War II is in there, but none of it is featured. It's all background, and it's all, the whole book weighs on the love between these two people, and sometimes like the way that they're angry with each other. It's not like some huge glorification of her own family. Like it's a really complicated relationship, but it's just the tiniest things: a scarf, a little wind-up ballerina figure. Those are the things that are put in the forefront, and all the big stuff is put in the background. So that's one thing. That's another thing that I sort of think about in my own work. Like, you don't have to put the grandiose stuff forward. You can tell it via the margins in a way.
I also think about Thomas and Viola because I think about how the historical elements are kind of like mundanities, but like I can't, in my brain at least, I can't detach that from the fact that this is a story of a black family, right? And what it is to like, I think like today, I live a life defined largely by my ability to put the current historical moment sometimes on a back burner and live through it, right? And so like it is, and think about the small touchable moments that I have to build around the historical moment so that I'm not drowning in the you know what I mean? So I think that what I love about Thomas and Viola is that the history is kind of a low hum, because like my understanding of it is that this was a family who is enduring history because they come from people who had to endure history, who came from people and so on.
I mean, that's like survival.
Yeah.
It's like, I feel like most people feel that today, right? Like, there are 1,000 things we could be doing right now instead of talking about Rita Dove. You know, like the elections are tomorrow. But it's all happening in the background. Like, this conversation is happening, and those things are still existing, and it's still finding its way into the room, but it's not at the center of it.
I think like on a craft level, one of the things that I love about how that book works, now that like I think about that, like when I first read it, it was not a thing that I necessarily was paying attention to, but is that she like, because it's so like character focused, it ends up sort of not being a history. Like people talk about her work as being historical, and it like obviously is. In a lot of ways, but when you're reading it, it doesn't feel that way. And I think there's a lot of things that she does to make that happen, like focusing on the characters and like putting the big events that you would know, like name dropping essentially, like the big historical events. It's like a thing that she kind of doesn't really do. Is one way that she does it. But she also like she has like a timeline that she has in the book, but it's at the end of the book. Like she could have put dates on every entry, which would immediately let you know what time period it was, but it would also immediately make you think, oh, this is, you know, this is this year, and all the things I know about this year, I'm gonna immediately bring you the poem before I read the very first page of it, right? And she like leaves that till the end, so that like it's both still present and not a thing that she's foregrounding. Yeah, I think that book is also great because it's a great, in a lot of ways, introduction to poetry for people, because a lot of times people think poetry is confusing and about a lot of different specific things that poetry often kind of is, like that it's love poetry or that it's about like being sad. And it's not like as if those things don't exist even within that book, but because like they're characters and you're following them along in a story, it reads kind of like short stories or prose, which people are way more used to reading and able to immediately grasp onto before they like start trying to figure out like what else this is doing as a poem. And another poem that I really love, by the way, it's not in that book, is Sightseeing, which is like about a church after a bombing and all the like limbs of the statues that have all like been collected. It's just like one of the many examples of like how beautiful her imagery is, and like full, like you know, the image of that, even just me having said it, is kind of like weighty, but she does this thing where this like what's almost like a snapshot evokes like all these feelings and historical and current feelings, and yeah, I love it.
Drawing on what you were saying, Keith, about sort of Thomas and Beulah as a great introduction to poetry, do you or does anyone else want to speak a little bit more to sort of the way that Dove's poetry uses narrative? Like, why does Thomas and Beulah need to be poetry? Why wouldn't it just be a novel? Like, what is the role of narrative within her poetry, or poetry in the narrative? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I would say one reason for it is, I think narrative collections essentially become epic poems. So it's like the equivalent of her having written one book-length poem. And there's like a lot of things that doing that does. One thing is it raises ordinary, like an ordinary black family's narrative to being something worthy of writing epics about, which, like, I think it's impossible not to feel, it's especially impossible not to feel as like a black student or black child or black young man or woman reading her collection, that the fact that this is a whole collection about her family or about this story means something that one poem about that could not, I think. And I think that she does the same thing in other books that are book-length poems, and it's a thing that she has in common also with Gwendolyn Brooks, who did the exact same thing. And it's part of the reason so Gwendolyn Brooks is like my favorite poet of all time. I think she's like possibly the greatest poet who has ever lived. And so I've like studied her work, and I've read her work as like similarly that in addition to sort of making a place for us to write our poems, she also is like making a place for like her people in the world, which is a thing that like epic poetry traditionally has done. It's like, this is the story of our people, and it means something regardless of where our people, where I am as an individual. There's this epic that tells of our greatness.
And I think like those narratives, I think all the time about, I guess I shouldn't like name the book that I'm thinking in opposition to this, but I'm always thinking about like the celebration of like Americana, right? Like I feel like a lot of like, and I'll like step outside and like bring music back in, right? Like I'm a big Bruce Springsteen fan. But even with my like consumption and enjoy in consuming Bruce Springsteen's music, I as a black person in America can only take my nostalgic whims towards Americana like to a certain point, right? Because it's like, yeah, pie is cool, but motherfuckers couldn't vote, so, you know, that's just like, you know what I mean? And so it's just like, yeah, you can like slide down your like factory slide at the end of the day, but like, you know, motherfuckers didn't have rights, so what are we hyped about? And so I think about all the time that like Rita Dove, and in like blacks too, like Gwendolyn Brooks, you know what I mean? Like some, like it's just like, I'm thinking about American Smooth again, which is like, you know, it's just like a lot of poems about just like old dances, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just like waltzes and shit. And I think like that is perhaps, I love what Keith said about kind of like building a space for like the ordinary story. Because I think I loved it. Granted, American Smooth was my first book, and I don't think it's like her best book. It's just the one that I found first and loved first. But I do have an affection for it, and I have affection for Brooks for the same thing, that there's like an Americana that's rooted in like black ordinary, right? Especially, and I don't want to like trash on this concept, but especially now when I think everyone wants to talk about black excellence, sure, whatever. But I think that moves so far away from the fact that just surviving is in some ways, you know what I mean? Like, depending on where you come from and like what you came out of, or what your ancestry looks like, that too is excellence. The ordinary is also excellence. And so I think that kind of Americana that shows up in Rita Dove's work and in Gwendolyn Brooks' work is really exciting for me.
Yeah, I just want to also say I love Gwendolyn Brooks, and so if you like Thomas and Beulah, go read Mon Martha.
Yeah.
So Hanif, you mentioned sort of music, like a couple of times, sort of the relationship between music or music criticism and Dove's work. But Dove herself, right, brings music into her poetry and also seems to work on some multimedia things. So do you or others want to speak to how Dove is drawing on music?
Someone else, sure.
All right.
Well, I mean, Rita Dove is like a known ballroom dancer. Her and her husband, Fred, ballroom dance. I believe like competitively sometimes. I don't know. It's great.
They have a board.
Yeah.
They have in their house so they can dance whenever they just practice little practice around.
That's wonderful. But I think you see that seeping into, and not only music and the like quality of sound, but also bodies, right? Like her poems focus on the body and are very physical in a way that dance, you know, if she were a musician, it might be more sound related and things like that, but it is like very physical. And so I think you see that in her work, and she has some poems about dancing. Yeah, like All of American Smooth. Like, there's a poem called like, what is it, Ta Ta Cha Cha. And yeah, so it like makes its way into it, but I think, yeah, there's like a ton of stuff about
I'm trying to find Rumba.
346 is where American Smooth starts, and it's weird that I know that by heart. But I think
Foxtrot Fridays. And so I think dance and like the body play a big role, maybe more so than music. Or like music is a part of that, but it is not all of it.
it's like assumed, right?
Yeah.
It's much like she was doing with the history shit in
Right.
Consuela, right? But music is assumed, much like the history is assumed. It's like assumed that since we are talking about the interior of dance, there also has to be something that drove the bodies to dance.
Right.
I think that's, yeah.
I think there's like also, so I don't know that much about music actually, and so when she writes about it, there's parts of it that I'm missing unless I like do some research on it, and so I see a lot more of the overlap between that exists in poetry, between music and poetry, between like lyrics, between just like the lives of musicians and composers and the lives of poets, and you know, going back far enough, they were the same lives because there was just like no difference between them. The book that I read of hers that handles this, of course, most directly, that applies to me in a lot of ways is the sonata. Is it Melodica?
I think it's Melodica.
Okay. Which is, you know, she wrote that about a person who, like in a different universe, would have been as famous as Beethoven, but for a variety of different reasons. Which she actually, in some ways, like in the beginning of that book, downplays race, and then immediately upon downplaying it is like, or is it important? Like she like literally says something like that, like right after it, which is like hilarious to me. You know, but that's like a book that's all about music and, but also is in a lot of ways like an ars poetica or an autobiographical work, because one of the things I know that she's interested in is in all the, like historically all the ways in which people who are incredibly important to history are not written about. She specifically talks about mothers sometimes, that we put all this weight on and know, just like deep inside of ourselves, know that the way that we are raised has a dramatic effect on the way that we are out in the world, what we love, what we do, whether or not we succeed, and yet there's just like nothing written about people's mothers. And all of that is just sort of bound up in I think in that collection of this person that she's giving the voice to, who didn't really appear in history. Beethoven like renamed the performance that he he dedicated to him, because he was angry. And I guess she found out about this violinist by watching a movie, and it was like a background character even in the movie. So she decided to write about it. And I don't know, all that is very interesting to me. I guess kind of the ways in which music and poetry sort of overlap.
Yeah, I've read that book. It's been 8 years or so. It's been my memory of it. It was like, oh, this is a book about Beethoven. It's just like looking at the poem titles before I even really got into it. Then I realized, no, this is another example of like putting the margins into the center. Like it's about Beethoven's one black friend. That's it. So Beethoven's in there, and there are Beethoven poems, and his voice is in there, but it's really about this other character who was pretty much otherwise lost to history before that book. And then there was a little renaissance of interest in him. His name was
I know, I'm maybe looking at
Bridgetower. George Bridgetower.
And he was supposed to be a prodigy, so at the time he was one of the greatest of all time. And even just that idea of, even though you're the greatest of all time or up there, it takes very little in some ways, right? The fact that he was black, or the fact that he pissed off Beethoven, like meant that no one knows who he is anymore.
And the slight was very small. It was like, he didn't even insult Beethoven's girlfriend. It was like he insulted somebody who Beethoven thought was cute, or something. It was like the smallest insult. And Beethoven just stormed off and said, you're erased from history now, basically.
Yeah.
Who among us hasn't, erased someone from history?
I guess I'm wondering, and I've been trying for quite some time to figure out the good way to ask this question. I may or may not have arrived at it. So a number of you have mentioned the importance of Dove, sometimes for you personally as a black writer, but also as a figure, right, who's made space for other writers of color. And I'm really interested in the work that she does around sort of black lives and black historical figures. And yet I'm also fascinated that she does this other work, right, that's in classical or mythical figures. So I'm wondering if anybody wants to speak to sort of how Dove seems to be particularly nimble around how she positions herself as a writer, how her work overall sort of inhabits different worlds.
I was looking at these Rosa Parks poems. I just really like those. I feel like people don't talk about those a lot, but I like them a lot. And the thing I like about perhaps Rita Dove, I think they're like, perhaps not, I think for like black writers or writers of color in particular, there's ways to write about history, and one way people write about history is trying to convince people that history is real, and the other way to write about history is on some shit where history is, what your history is, right? And this is like a slight tangent, but I've been kind of grinding my teeth about this recently because what I love about Rita Dove is kind of in line with this. I was thinking there's like a Harriet Tubman biopic coming out, right, sometime, and I wasn't excited, you know what I mean, because I just can't. There are a lot of reasons. One, I think that the movie about American slavery is celebrated because of its impermanence, right? Like we can give 12 Years a Slave an Academy Award and then a month later forget that it happened. And the problem with that is, if you want to make a movie about Harriet Tubman, that's fine. But we've done some things, and I say we and mean the literary canon has done some things where one, it's made the Underground Railroad romantic, right? And that shit was not romantic. And I get that there were songs and stars and all the stuff that lends itself to romantic aesthetics. That shit was not romantic. Two, in order to fully reckon with Harriet Tubman as a figure, one has to first reckon with the fact that she risked her life to free slaves, and to reckon with that, one must reckon with the fact that they were actually slaves, right? And we're just not there. And so what I love about Rita Dove, particularly with the Rosa Parks stuff, but also with history in general, is that she's not trying to convince a country of its history, right? Because I think that, and maybe this is a cynical way to look at things, but I think there's an understanding that she has that we're maybe too far gone to be honest as a country with ourselves. And so there's no point in writing from the standpoint of convincing one of history. It's more or less this history happened and I know this history and I'm going to flesh it out the way I want it to live. And I think I think about those Rosa Parks poems all the time in regards to writing history as though you know it, as though you had a stake in it and you were there watching it unfold as a spectator and not as someone trying to hold up a newspaper and say, look, 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 look.
Mm-hmm.
And like bringing that off the page, like outside of her work in poetry and like in her work as like an advocate of poets and poetry, I just love, I'm gonna read a little bit of, in 2005, a new anthology of poems was released, and the collection had like 247 poems in the anthology. 3 of those poems were by Black people. 1 was by a Black woman, and it wasn't a poet, it was a singer. So they were like lyrics to a song by a Black woman. And this is 2005, like not that long ago. Everyone in here was born was alive then. And she wrote a letter in Poetry magazine in response. So 2 poets wrote a review of the anthology that was published in Poetry magazine. She wrote a response to that review. And she said, I've been at the business of poetry for some time. I know that I'm considered more of a non-militant writer. As I get older, however, my patience wears thinner. I've grown weary of having to point out what should be obvious to anyone with sense and sensibility. I resent the complacent, single-minded arrogance of myopic men of letters whose curious brand of goodwill perpetuates racist selectivity. I resent their transparent, self-serving attacks on concepts such as multiculturalism and feminism that have propelled our society toward a true democracy. I resent the presumption that their majority of numbers absolves them from paying attention to fair representation, leaving it up to those who have been marginalized to take note, tally the figures, and mount protest. What a waste of energy, emotion, enterprise. No wonder Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man gave up and went underground. Well, my mama didn't raise a bean counter. I have better things to do, like trying to sit down and write a good poem, for example. And that just is like, she's not trying to like prove anything. She's just letting folks know like other people are also writing and but she's not trying to convince these editors. She's just saying like, open your eyes.
It's like has anyone seen Paris is Burning?
Yeah.
It's like the iconic shade thing, right?
Yeah.
I don't have to tell you because you know what I mean, you already know.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I love, that I think she's doing is just sort of being unapologetic about all the things that she finds interesting, which is a thing that, so as like a person who is like racially ambiguous and actually is like never identified as Black unless I say something, I understand like a certain kind of desire to write to prove one's Blackness, right? And other people feel that for a variety of other different reasons. Like sometimes it has to do with like class or where a person grew up or how they talk or whatever. That there's like a certain desire to write a specific kind of poem that like advocates for your Blackness or for a kind of Blackness. And Rita Dove just like doesn't seem concerned. She either is like confident enough that she's just like, whatever, here's a bunch of stuff I love and find interesting, or like I don't entirely know what causes that, or like what you know, like Prince is the same thing like with sexuality. I feel like it's just like, here it is, and I don't have to like do all the things that other people often feel they have to do in order to prove their masculinity or their Blackness or whatever. And she like, so she does that. She clearly finds history interesting. The things that she reads that leads her to like find out about these things is a thing that other people might read and not write about because they don't think other people find it interesting, you know, or whatever, the variety of different reasons that you know, she was in a place actually in a lot of ways where it would make sense for her to try to write poems that were like just like clearly, like every poem that she wrote like contained the word Black, which there are like a lot of poets who did that, who still do that. And there's like not necessarily anything wrong with that. I think that it's just like a different kind of work. but I'm just like impressed at the fact that she has like, I mean, it says, you know, these are her collected poems throughout, first of all, it's like only till 2004. She's like written a crazy amount of poems, and the scope of those poems is just like amazing to me, and about all kinds of different things. I love that. And I think, again, like one of the things that ends up doing is allowing for like the reality that like Black people like don't only like Black music, like music made by Black artists. They don't only like movies that contain Black like artists. Like Blacks in America are American, and so they love all the things that Americans love. And she's writing about like both that and all the historical things that other Americans, you know, are reading as well.
My response to that question was pretty similar to yours, just like the nimbleness, and this isn't a very rigorous thought, but just like being impressed by how many different projects there are. So the first two books kind of seem like they're kind of about all sorts of stuff. Thomas and Beulah, Family History, American Smooth, Ballroom Dancing, On the Bus with Rosa Parks, Civil Rights, Sonata Melodica, Classical Music, and I'm missing one. Mother Love, about motherhood, but told via the Persephone, Demeter, Hades Greek myth.
Yeah. So yeah, Greek myth.
Who else could write that specific combination of types of books with those topics? In American Smooth, we have to look at the back matter of the book to figure this out, but all the epigraphs are from Star Trek Voyager. All the quotes, and she doesn't say it, and we have to look it up in the back. So there's like this like sci-fi thing going on top of all that. So there are very few American poets. I feel like when you get to the state of being a figure in poetry, a lot of poets I see do that have gotten there because they figured out a thing and they cranked that thing out for a lot of books. And to reach this level of fame, but also just like throw out the last book and the book before that and just start a new thing, like you don't see that ranginess all the time, especially in like the, you know, poet laureate, Pulitzer level of poetry.
Do we have 15 minutes for audience questions? Do you all have 15 minutes?
Yeah.
So we've all talked a lot. What are you guys thinking about that you'd like to ask our panelists? You guys are Kenyon students. Somebody has a question.
I guess this isn't directly about Rita Dove, but more about what we were just talking about. I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and they told me that they like were walking around in their room, and they were kind of like reciting some lines of my poetry, and like trying to like figure out if they could get to the next line, and that they had like figured out like my formula. Like they knew they could write like me, and that like stuck with me for like the rest of the week, because I was like, am I writing the same thing over and over, or do I have like a style or whatever? And I got worried about like finding myself in a rut and just writing about the same thing over and over. And you see someone like Rita Dove, who clearly does not have that problem. And so you guys as poets, have you ever found yourself worrying about that? And if you have, how did you face it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like a challenge. So it's definitely a thing I think about, because, you know, the way that you get good at something is by doing it over and over. Like that's like how practice works. And so, so on one hand, you know, if all you ever do is jump around, you essentially like never really get good at anything. I think. You can maybe generally kind of get better at writing, but you're like never really like pushing yourself to that next level at a certain thing. So I think for me, a lot of it has to do with like deciding what you're comfortable with experimenting with, essentially. Like you don't have to, I don't think, in your work, just radically change what you're doing all the time. I think one of the things that Rita Dove writes, I think you can tell like a Rita Dove poem. So she has like a style that she's stuck with. I think she's jumping subjects, which a lot of times people don't do that either. You know, they choose subjects that are very similar to one another. And so that's like an impressive thing that she's doing that is maybe challenging like her kind of the kind of poetry she wants to write. But there are like all kinds of other ways to do that as well in your own work. Yeah, for me, I've like have recently started writing like radically different poems that like use visual stuff. But that's like both scary and potentially like going to be a disaster. Like it might not be a thing that I either can pull off or want to pull off, and so that's just like the nature, I think, sometimes of trying to experiment. That itself is also a risk. I don't know if I answered your question.
I think too, like having your interest should inform your style too, right? Like I think with Rita Dove, her interest, like the reason in my head at least, the American Smooth is so different is because it takes on the physicality and movements and sonic elements of dance. So the interests inform the stylistic shift, and I think it's important for me at least as a writer to have both a healthy bit of admiration and respect for the last thing I've written, but also to feel a bit challenged by severing from it. I think all the time about, I'm sorry that I talk in musical references, it's like, I'm sorry. But I think all the time about, you know, after Nirvana came out, Nevermind, the very first line on In Utero is on a song called Serve the Servants, and Kurt Cobain says, teenage angst has paid off well, now I'm bored and old. Right? And so it's like this hilarious kind of like movement, and even that is a movement forward, right? And so I'm saying like, I hold everything, and I think Rita Dove is like they're saying like holding your past work in high regard, but also having a small kind of, to feel challenged by it is kind of where the corners turn.
I don't think having a formula is a bad thing. I think it's finding ways to surprise yourself within it. So like how does a book like Terrence Hayes' Sonnets, the Sonnets for My, what is it? American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin, right? That book has the same formula for every single poem, which is a sonnet. And yet there you are still surprised when you get to the next one. And so what is the surprise? It's the language. And I think being able to find, you know, so maybe you do have a formula, but how are you going to surprise yourself and how are you going to surprise a reader within that formula? And that's, you know, it's not bad. Play into it, like dig deeper and you know, maybe get new friends.
Yes,
What's your friend doing walking around this room reciting your poems?
Other questions? Yeah.
I often kind of struggle with my own, like, discerning if I'm writing about, like, identity to bring marginalized history towards the center or to prove identity. And it's something that I'm like just, it's constantly running in the back of my head. And I was just wondering if you guys, because this is something that you guys brought up with Dove's work, which is that she never has to do that. She never has to try to prove anything about herself through her writing. And I was wondering, just besides having like her just sheer scope of topics that she's written about, if anything else like attests to that difference between the two.
I think it's that her voice is confident, right? Like she's an authority on dance in American Smooth. She's an authority on Thomas and Beulah's story, both like the factual story of her grandparents and the like personas that she made up, right? And so she's never, I don't think anyone questions her because she's an authority of those things and an authority of what she doesn't know. So she's like, she owns up to the stuff she doesn't know, but also takes like ownership of what she does know. And so no one's questioning her blackness, right? Because she's not allowing for it within the work itself. And so I think, I don't know, some workshop professor somewhere along the way did the whole like poem as a house metaphor. But what I really appreciate about that metaphor is he was always like, you gotta close all the windows and close all the doors, right? Or else people are gonna get out and find ways out and find ways in. And so I think Rita Dove does that. And her poems are like very tight. There is no room to get in or get out, right? You can't find other exits because she takes you exactly where she wants you to be. And so you trust her. And you trust the authority of whatever topic whether it's like Rosa Parks or the Cha-Cha.
I think, so I could talk about identity and like proving it for like a million years probably. but I think there's also something that makes it complicated in the sense that, so identity is like a push and pull between what you identify as and what other people identify you as. And so like in the case that a person is not often or is never identified as the thing that they identify as, that struggle is very different than the other way around. So I think actually like for a black woman, a lot of times, like if a black woman tried not to say that they were not a black woman, the challenge would come from all over the place about the fact that they're wrong, like you're a black woman. On the other hand, for someone who maybe their identity is the relationship that they have with their identity is different. So like a poet like Carl Phillips, who a lot of people may not know is black when they meet him, and who doesn't directly write about it. His identity, I have seen challenged, that he's not writing black enough poems, or that he's not black, or and he does occasionally have a poem where he writes about that, but he has, the vast majority of his poems are not about that topic. And so I imagine what he writes about in his struggle is probably different than Rita Dove's. And so, which is, I guess, all just to say that like, her confidence arises from like also the particularities of like her existence in America and the way that she grew up and where she grew up. And so I both am like impressed by it, but it's also like not a formula that like everyone necessarily can follow towards like, towards greatness or towards towards whatever it is that you're trying to write towards. Like, identity is just like such a complicated thing that I often feel like writing towards it is just like intensely personal, and you're gonna end up having to figure it out on your own, sort of. Even with all these different like heroes to sort of see how they did it, it's still going to end up being like coming down to your work.
The thing that I notice in Dove's poetry that I think is one way she communicates that confidence is that she doesn't really often include the explanatory comma. So she assumes you either know who she's talking about or you're going to find out, as Andy did, right? So parsley, I did not do the research, so now I know. But I have worked with Banneker and, oh darn it, which is the other one I did this summer? David Walker, right? With a couple of groups this summer and this fall, and folks did not know who those people are. And I'm not going to tell you either. So, but you should find out, and you should read her poetry about them. And her like expectation that these figures are important and you should know about them. Like she's going to tell you a little bit about them, but she's going to leave it to you to do the rest. And so I think that's one work of sort of bringing people from margin to center without having something to prove, because it's on you as the reader to do that. Should we take one more? Sure. All right, one more. One more question. Or it's Monday afternoon and we're all right. So if you have other questions, oh yes. Yeah.
I guess this is a question about writing for yourself versus writing for an audience and how you balance that. I'm in a poetry workshop right now with Andy Grace. And sometimes I find myself too worried about what people in the class or what even my professor might think about the poem. And how, I guess I'm asking, how does someone balance writing for the self and writing for an audience, or if you should just pick one? I don't even know. It's something that I've thought about a lot, and I just couldn't come to an answer, and so I'll just throw it out and just wing.
Well, let me ask. I didn't. Probably the worst person to answer this actually. I didn't study poetry in college. I didn't get an MFA. I don't have any kind of in-class experience, and so this is mostly curiosity. What are you worried about when you were worried? You said you're worried about what the class will think of your poem, or what Andy will think of your poem. What are you worried about?
Well, it's like a two-parter, I guess. So a part of it is me being the only black person in the class, and the majority of the class being white women, and so them not necessarily connecting or being able to understand my work in a way that I do, or maybe my friends back home do. And also, I think that at least in my poetry, I try and tackle things about the self that are very difficult to talk about and understand. And in grappling with that, I worry, like, what is this person going to think? Like, will they even understand like what headspace or what angle I'm trying to come at, in trying to figure out this thing about myself or my past or my relationship with someone or whatever.
My super short thing, and only on the first part at least, is try writing for the people back home. And the people in the class. I mean, one, Andy's really smart and really like an effective teacher. And, like, real talk, this isn't bullshit, right?
Yeah.
Your workshop instructor should serve the poem first. You know what I mean? Like, one of my mentors was a poet who I used to think was like really cold or whatever, but you know, I'd like bring a poem about my mother's death, and he would be like, well, we're gonna talk about this as a poem. The interior is like, whatever it is, this is a poem, so we're gonna talk about it as a poem. And so, at least in terms of like the identity shit, and I like teach I teach in an MFA program now where there is only one black student, and I tell him a similar thing, right? So the people who understand, who have the ear for what you're trying to reach for. But you know, again, I'm very like detached from academia, so I don't really know what it's like inside those places.
Yeah, I would say my answer to that, both in identity and just like whatever it is that you write about, often has to do with, like, you should always, I think, at some point care about your audience, but you should also like ask who your audience is. And if the people who you're sharing your poems with currently are not your audience, that's unfortunate, and there's like a bunch of, I guess, different ways to sort of try to get around that by like going online and trying to find a community, or you know, Cave Canem was like the way that I found a community of black poets. But like just keeping that in mind, that sometimes when something is poorly received, it's because the audience that received it is not the audience that will ever receive your poetry, right? Like there's a ton of people who will never love Rita Dove's poetry for a variety of different reasons. And at a certain point, you start, like, I think sometimes when you're in that space long enough and you're getting better at writing, you start creating an audience, like people who you're not writing towards, like just get what you're doing and they love it. So it's like not necessarily a matter of just like not caring that people don't get necessarily your work, but I think that comes with just like getting better at writing.
Definitely find the community. If people will, I don't know. I said I shouldn't answer this, and I'm sorry that I'm talking a lot. But I always think about the workshop space as who in this room can provide answers to the questions this poem is asking, right? Like,
Or ask the question
or
that's
ask the
going to
question
help.
that's right, or ask the question that's going to help the poem. And to me, I don't know. I say this, I don't know, I teach at Kenyon Writers, or like I have the past 2 years, and I just make it super simple, right? When you walk into the room, everyone's a writer. I'm a writer, y'all are all writers. We're not gonna have this hierarchy of like educator, student. So like, we're gonna get down to the nitty-gritty of this shit, and like, if we're reading something, everyone has the same responsibility to answer the questions being asked by the piece, or to ask more questions to further discussion. And I feel like in a workshop space, like, that is the first question. And then, hopefully, you are writing towards an audience that can receive and better, like, make you feel whole.
And sometimes the question, you know, like I was the only Latinx writer in my MFA program. And oftentimes I was like resistant to the questions of the workshop. And then I kind of opened myself up to the idea that like perhaps answering some of those questions in my own writing could broaden my audience in a way that I hadn't considered, right? Like I was super tied to like particular things in my work. But then as the questions would come in, and you know, in a workshop you can like field which questions aren't gonna serve you. But sometimes there are some that'll like sneak their way in and you think like, I shouldn't have to explain this. But then if you consider like, but if I did explain this, who else would this then be a poem for or to, right? And so I think, you know, finding the readers of your work who maybe don't look like you or aren't from the same places as you, but who are serving the poem and who want to like further the poem and maybe like broaden it is also could be useful in opening your work to other audiences without having to sacrifice your aesthetic or what you're trying to write about.
Well, hey, let's thank our panelists. And thank you all for coming.
What's the rest of our events? Sorry, you make your last comment.